In this video, we're going to prime our 308 Winchester brass for the load that we developed earlier. If you recall, the load was based on a Hornady bullet that we found in both the Hornady and the Hodgdon manuals, using the Varget powder for a reasonably equivalent load. The Hornady manual used the large rifle primers from Federal to develop their loads. The Hodgdon manual used the match version of the large rifle primer from Federal. For all intents and purposes, at least for our purposes here, those are interchangeable. It's nice that they were essentially in agreement with the selection of Federal, but that's very seldom the case. A lot of times you find different brands in different manuals, and you just can't get 100% correspondence between the two loads and the two manuals. The bullet and the powder are the two most important considerations. The match, and sometimes called bench rest versions of primers, are essentially the equivalent of their standard primers. They're simply manufactured to tighter tolerances for more accurate loading and shooting. They're also a little bit more expensive, but for our purposes here, they're interchangeable. Now, as we've discussed in earlier videos, and we'll discuss here, primers can be substituted and often have to be substituted simply due to availability, with two caveats. One of them is that you are only substituting brand. You should never substitute Magnum for standard, standard for Magnum, rifle for pistol, pistol for rifle, that sort of thing. But the first caveat is that you can substitute if you are only substituting exactly like primers and the only difference is brand. The second caveat is that you are only doing the substitution when you're using minimum published loads. And the reason for that's very simple. Testing has shown that the substitution of just the primer just by brand can change the pressures in a given load upon the ignition of the powder anywhere from a few hundred psi to several thousand psi. At published minimum loads, that differential is not relevant or dangerous, but at worked up loads, especially the closer you get to a maximum published load, that pressure differential could suddenly, accidentally, inadvertently put you in a pressure place that you had not intended to be and could actually risk you or the gun. So because we can substitute and because we're using the minimum published load and we're using large rifle primers only, I didn't have the Federal in stock, but I do have the CCI in stock and the Remington in stock for the standard large rifle primer, which we're going to substitute. We're going to use the CCI primer here. We're going to discuss two different means of priming cases. There are a number of automated procedures and pieces of equipment. We're not going to go into any of those because, as I'm sure you're aware, all of our videos are oriented towards basic practices and first steps for beginners. So to start with, loading on the press, there's a device, or actually two devices, that come standard with any press, and they're simply little arms that hold the primers, where you can load the primers into the cases right from the press. The reason there's two is they're two different sizes. You can see the difference in thickness of the material that forms the cup that holds the primer. The thicker material has a smaller opening. This is for small rifle and small pistol. The larger opening is for large rifle, large pistol, which is what we're going to use here for our 308. The way this is installed is you simply remove the appropriate shell holder, and this drops into the slot that's machined in the ram on all presses. It simply falls into place, and as you can see, it tips forward so that the opening is exposed for you to deposit the primer in there. You put the shell holder back in for the correct size, and then you take one primer out of your case and you simply insert that primer with the correct side out into that little priming pocket. Now, you'll notice from the picture on the screen that the open side of the primer is facing out, because that's the part that's going to get inserted into the brass. That's the side where the explosion is driven in through the hole in the primer pocket into the powder to cause ignition. There's two ways of doing this wrong. The obvious one is to have it in upside down so that you're putting it in the case upside down, rendering the case useless, and with the plunger pushing on it, it's even possible for you to crush the anvil and ignite it in the process of inserting it. But the other way, which can be done, believe it or not, and I've done it myself, is you can be moving too fast and too carelessly and drop this primer in this pocket sideways. So when you go to insert it, you're trying to insert it sideways. It obviously won't fit, but worse, it won't fit fully. And so you literally wind up with the primer stuck in the case, and the case can't even come out of the shell holder. So you wind up disposing of the case, the shell holder, and the primer all together as a unit, and you need a spare shell holder to be able to continue. There are some wacky recommendations on the internet about how you would dispose of bad or improperly inserted primers. I don't buy any of them. I've talked to CCI directly, and they told me two things that I think are relevant and important here. One of them is this little bit of handling to put these primers in these pockets on this arm is not a problem. The way modern primers are designed, the oils from your skin are not going to contaminate that compound and are not going to interfere with the performance of the primer. And then the second thing they told me is that if you ever have primers that need to be disposed of, and that would include cases where you have a case, primer, and shell holder all attached together, the proper disposal would be to deliver them to your local fire department, where the people are trained in the proper disposal of explosive materials. Now, the way we're going to insert this primer in the case is to take an unprimed, finished, prepped brass case and put it in the shell holder. And then as we raise the handle on the press, you'll notice the arm cams on the body of the press and swings the primer up under inside the ram, and it's facing up towards the shell holder. Then it goes through the opening in the shell holder, contacts the bottom of the case at the primer pocket, and then when you put a little bit of extra pressure, a fair amount of extra pressure actually, upwards on this handle, it properly seats the primer in the brass. Now as you lower the handle, you'll notice the ram raises, the arm cams back out of the way, and this primer pocket is now empty. The primer is properly inserted in our case. That raises the next question, and that is, what is the correct amount of insertion in a case for a primer? The textbook answer is 2 to 4 thousandths of an inch. And the reason for it is simple. The slight recess protects the primer from coming in contact with the breech face with a trigger or firing pin or striker inadvertently. The second reason you want it seated slightly below level is because that's the correct dimension that's formed in the primer pocket, in this case when it's first produced. The material between this bottom surface and the inner surface of this case is called the web, and the primer pocket is formed in that web. You want to have the primer seated against the web, and the reason you want that is because when the striker or firing pin hits the primer, you want all of that force to go to deforming the primer and crushing the compound against the anvil and creating a uniform, complete explosion of that compound to drive that force through the hole in the primer pocket into your powder for consistent ignition. If the primer is not fully seated in the priming pocket, some of that force can go into further driving the primer itself into the primer pocket rather than on deforming the case and crushing the compound against the anvil. So you could get incomplete or partial ignition, you could get hang fires, you could get complete misfires if this is not fully seated. When the cases are manufactured, the primer pockets are manufactured to the correct tolerances so that when the correct primer is properly seated against the web, it should be 2 to 4 thousandths recessed. Now that can actually be measured. Most calipers or micrometers have an end that protrudes that's actually a depth gauge. You can turn this on and actually measure the depth of insertion to the base of the case. In this instance, it's about 3 thousandths, a tiny bit over. That's perfect for this case. It's between the 2 and the 4 thousandths of an inch. You don't want to necessarily have to measure all of them, but you'll learn the feel of the priming process, and you'll learn what total insertion is for your cases. The easiest way to do it is to simply run your finger across it. You can't measure 2 to 4 thousandths with your finger, but you can learn to very easily determine that it's slightly recessed. That's good. Second test is to simply set it on a flat surface. If there's no wobble and you know it's slightly recessed, you're good to go. The second method that we're going to go through for inserting primers is actually my preferred method, and that's using a hand priming tool. My favorite choice is the RCBS hand priming tool because it's, to me, the easiest to use. It has a universal shell holder, and the universal shell holder means simply that it holds all of the shells in the proper position with the primer pocket centered over the opening where the plunger or anvil pushes the primer into the pocket when you squeeze the handle. Some manual hand priming tools require you to substitute either the same or different shell holders to hold them, and that to me is simply more of a pain in the neck than the universal shell holder. I have used this particular RCBS shell holder to load everything from 223 to my 480 Ruger cases. That's about the full range. Actually, no, I go down to 380 brass for handguns, so that's about the full range of the size of cases, and they all have been handled just fine in this particular tool. There's one possible conversion you have to make. There is a plunger or anvil that's a smaller one for small rifle, small pistol primers, and there's a connector that's a different one for small or large primers. The black and the larger plunger are for the large primers. The white connector and the smaller plunger are for the smaller primers. RCBS's instructions show you the simple way of exchanging those two parts. Now, the way you load this is you simply take the tray and you open it up, and you take your primers and you open the case to a row of primers. As you can probably see in here, most of the time they're oriented in the correct fashion. You can see here in this third row in, one of these primers is the wrong direction up. You want to be careful of that, but that's not a problem. We can correct that a little bit later. What you do is you take your tray and you open it to either 1 or 2 rows of primers. I don't like to put more than 20 in a primer at a time. Put the lid upside down on this and reverse it. We've now simply transferred those primers into the case. The reason I don't like to do more than 10 to 20 at a time is that the compound in primers is an actual explosive, unlike smokeless powders. And so the more of them you have in the immediate vicinity of each other, if you ever have a primer accidentally go off during the loading process, you want fewer primers around it rather than more. The case cover is put back on this. It's simply snapped into place. Confirm 2 things. One, that the little loading gate is closed, and the other one is that all your primers are oriented with the open side up. This tray simply slides into the connector in the priming tool. I open the gate just enough to let 1 or 2 primers through at a time for the reasons mentioned. If one of them ever went off accidentally, this gate keeps all the other primers a safe distance away, so there's a minimum amount of number of primers that will go off at one time. You can see that a primer has fallen into the center of the tool that's resting on the plunger, and you take the case, put it in the universal shell holder. The last step, and an important step, is you always aim this away from your face. I've never had it happen, but it is possible to have a primer go off during the insertion process, and if it does, you want the blast to safely go through the case and out away from your face, not towards your face. There's nothing to be gained from looking at or in this while it's being primed. You simply squeeze the handle, and it properly inserts the primer, and it's done. You take the next case, slide the next primer into place, and do it. I prefer this to the press for a couple of reasons. One is this is faster. The other is, another one is I don't have to handle the primers where I have to insert them separately and individually. And here these are all oriented in the correct fashion. They're easy to drop into place one at a time. But the third reason is this, I believe, has actually more leverage and more sensitivity than this. There's a lot of ways here that you lose the feel for the actual insertion of the primer. Here you literally feel it one at a time as you're inserting it. And I actually find that my primers go in slightly deeper, better seated against the webbing using this tool than this tool. I would simply run my finger across it, put it on a flat surface, put it in the case, pull out the next one, and finish it. So we're going to finish priming the rest of these cases, and then we're going to proceed to our next video where we measure powder and charge the cases.